Should I start over? All right. So, back on January 5th, 2020, we had gone back and forth with our local police department, trying to convince them that our son was not in his right state of mind after he'd gone missing. Throughout the course of his disappearance, there were behaviors uncovered that indicated how bizarre his actions were. But according to our responding officers, those behaviors were all within the range of normal. And this remained the case despite our continued pleas to the contrary. At one point, at our behest, our child was found by a state trooper sleeping at a rest stop late into the night, an hour and a half away from home. When notified by our local officer, I knew this meant there was something terribly wrong. I was told that my son said he was out partying with friends and he'd make his way home soon. As desperately as I wanted to believe this was true, I knew it couldn't be. In fact, I later learned that my son never said it. As I shared with the officers, I knew my child's friends. I knew he'd never been in the place he was found. I knew he'd never been out that late on a school night. I knew he'd never so much as even missed dinner without notifying us. I knew what was in a range of normal for my child and for his behavior. And when I shared that I was afraid he wouldn't make it home, that I didn't believe he could be lucid or in any condition to drive, I was told that my child, and I quote, was mentally fine. I was told he's not having a psychotic break that they could determine. This is the language the officer used. This officer did not have CIT training. I believe officers are doing their best and lean into the training that they've received. Their training now needs to reflect the rise of mental illness. Collaboration with a social worker can offer additional guidance on how to take action rather than being dismissed, as it was in our case. Our officers should have been trained to protect my son. Instead, we're living with an incident that leaves a wake of unrelenting pain and suffering, mostly for Ellis. If they had CIT, perhaps there'd be no arrest, and my child would have received prompt treatment necessary for his recovery. That's what he deserves. His life matters. Instead, he's navigating his serious mental illness through the Department of Corrections. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story and background. I do remember you coming forward before and testifying as well. So we appreciate your persistence and sticking to it. Often it will take some cycles for ideas to get traction or pieces of it to work its way through. So again, we appreciate questions from members of the committee. Representative Howard.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I didn't want your story to be missed by anybody watching either.
Oh, I appreciate it. I didn't realize it was on.
That's okay.
Thank you.
But I didn't want to interrupt you either. I appreciate being here. I know it's a difficult story. You and I have talked on numerous occasions, and I understand your story. And if it's all right with you, I'll leave it up to you if you want to, because we uni-focus sometimes here. But had officers at that time had the right CIT training, certainly Ellis wouldn't be where he is today, but an incident wouldn't have taken place, right?
An incident would have taken place?
Would not have taken place.
It would not have taken place, yes.
Do you feel comfortable just describing that briefly, why he's where he is and the incident that took place subsequent to him not going to the hospital that day? Or if you don't feel comfortable, I'll move on.
I'm more than comfortable to explain. So, I mean, we spent upwards of 17 hours going back and forth with the police department, trying to convince them that his behavior was just so abnormal. And we presented several pieces of evidence that indicated that. I mean, I can go into them in detail. There was so much there. And by this time, I've had the opportunity to go back and look at all of the body camera footage to really see what were, you remember things hindsight, and then you see what you said and how much what we were actually saying indicated, which should have sent alarm bells off for anybody who had crisis intervention training. We had started with our police department about 10 p.m., asking them to intervene. My son was found after midnight, an hour and a half away from home. At that time, we were sure that he was not in his right state of mind. And that's when we really started with the behavior so unusual. So there was an opportunity there. There was an opportunity a couple of hours later when I called because my son had never come home. And at that time, I was told by the officer that our issue was a family matter, not a police matter. listening to the footage between the officer and our police department and what, what their narrative was, it was all along the line of, this is a mother who is just alarmed because her son is not home. My son had never missed dinner in his entire life without calling us ever. He was a very serious student. He was an international baccalaureate student on the honor roll. He was supposed to be at the library working on a school project. It was a Sunday night. The project was due on Monday. The fact that my son never showed up for school the next day was not enough to inspire our police department to take action. The fact that we were able to show an officer literally a slew of text messages from our son, like, this is how we normally respond with our son. This is how we correspond with him. His father at the time showed the officer multiple text messages from New Year's Eve saying, showing we text our son and within 15 minutes, our son texts us back. This is what's normal for him. New Year's Eve, he's at a party overnight with his friends and we're texting him, and he's texting us back in 15 minutes. Over the course of the last 24 hours, we're texting our son saying, we are scared to death. We can't find you. The police are looking for you. We're not hearing anything back. And they thought it was normal. The background was like, the parents are going to try and report the car stolen, trying to figure out how to keep us from doing that. We actually did try to report the car stolen. They told us we couldn't. There were so many red flags. This went into the next day. It wasn't until after 1 o'clock in the afternoon that my son had his incident. They had him. They could have easily found him again. He did not go far from where he was found at midnight. They just made no effort to bring him home. And I just believe it was because they did not have the training to recognize what the hell was going on. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
And now he is in prison, unsentenced. We're going into our 4th year. And no corrections officers do not have CIT training. They have not wanted CIT training. Our cable that does the CIT training here in Connecticut has trained Rhode Island's corrections officers. They wanted it. Our officers do not.
Thank you. And just so my colleagues understand why he's in prison. He's in prison because that day an incident took place that caused the harm to another person that wouldn't have taken place had he been going to the hospital, right?
Yes.
So I know it's difficult for you to tell it, but I know that you advocate on behalf of your son and others. And I think it's important to realize that we talk in this committee on a variety of different issues of helping our members of our community with mental illness into treatment before something happens. And your story is one that I've retold numerous times as an example where I talk about Ellis and say, here's a young man who's trying to battle now his mental illness from jail because his mental illness caused a significant incident of violence in the community. So we have an obligation to protect the public, but and part of what happens is it's not just cable and recognition, but it's the ability to act appropriately in the moment to prevent these things from happening. And if that had happened with Ellis, we would be having a totally different conversation today. So I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the fact you continue to come forward, you continue to tell their story, and really hopefully broaden not only my colleagues on this committee, but the legislature at large and the people of Connecticut as to why we need to have a variety of options for all of the members of our community that we deal with to avoid these things from happening. And so I thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Other questions from members of the committee?